All right, welcome to the Big Brown Gadfly, where we give a hard time to people who need to be given a hard time, just like Socrates' horse. All right, this is Bobby Lopez, your usual host. We're going to be praying that angels are storming heaven to make sure that the internet signal does not get broken today and the big state doesn't try to sync our broadcast. But I have a very special guest. I'm really excited because I have been following this gentleman's writing online. I have so many things in agreement with him. I really want to get his thoughts on a lot of stuff. So it's really amazing to be able to have Pedro Gonzalez here. A couple housekeeping points. We're going to have a new permanent schedule Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. I think things are going really well between me and Gatekeeper, so I'm excited to have a permanent time slot. That will be really great. You should consider buying this book, Church and State, How the Left Used the Church to Take Over America. I have a chapter in there about the problem with higher education, and I talk a lot about Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro and a lot of the people that Pedro has really been bringing some interesting insights about as well. And lastly, if you want to join the conversation online, there is a discussion group online for this show. The website is here on the screen. It's gatekeepers.online/group/the-big-brown-gadfly/discussion. So with all of that, without any further ado, I have Pedro Gonzalez. He is an assistant editor at American Greatness. His work has appeared in Newsweek magazine. He also is a contributor to Chronicles Mag. It's through Chronicles Mag that I got to meet him finally, because Paul Gottfried is a friend of his, and he's someone that I have been communicating with and doing some writing for. So Pedro, welcome very much to the Big Brown Gadfly. How are you doing?
I'm well. Thanks for having me. Paul is a good friend.
Yes. Okay. So let me just get right to it. You have inflamed a lot of people's tempers on Twitter because you are not a never Trumper, but you are not a Trumper. So just in real simple terms, because what I really want to find out from you is what your vision of is our future leadership. What is our future leadership going to look like? And for you, it's not Trump. It's not Trump fantasies. It's not what you call the myth of Trump, right? So can you just tell us what exactly is your position regarding what happened for the last 4 years?
So I had this conversation with a friend recently, and they actually put it very well, because this friend is a lot like me, and they worked in the administration, and we came to the conclusion in this back and forth that ultimately our positions boiled down to being in favor of Trump's 2016 agenda. In other words, we are Trumpists in this purest sense, right? We subscribe and believe in the ideas that Trump successfully crusaded to the White House in 2016 on. And the problem is that sometime between him successfully pulling off this upset and becoming president and 2020, something changed fundamentally. The man who crusaded against the establishment, who crusaded against the GOP orthodoxy, against the conservative orthodoxy, ended up embracing it almost immediately after becoming president. And I saw warning signs, but I defended Trump vehemently basically until late, I would say mid to late 2019, when I think the contradictions between who Trump campaigned as and who he was governing as just became, for me, too much. And so I started to explicitly criticize him then. So putting it that way, I actually, in one way, I am actually extremely Trumpist in the sense that like I said, I believe in the original mandate, and I think that mandate is still a viable platform. So I think that the way forward is actually looking back to where we started and recovering these ideas and making sure that they are not, one, discredited, because there's certainly an ongoing effort to return the GOP or return the movement that started with Trump to, let's call it Reaganism, to the consensus, right, that Trump crusaded against. So that's one thing that's happening. And the other thing that's happening is there is an attempt to basically justify Trump's transformation into an establishment Republican as actually, well, that was a good thing. It's good that Trump didn't do infrastructure investment, which was his most popular platform promise. It's good that Trump didn't end the carried interest loophole. It's good that Trump wasn't really a populist. Uh,
Right.
so I think these are two different battles that are erupting right now on the right.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because one of the reasons why I was so drawn to your work is I felt like I was isolated on an island for a certain amount of time because I got up my courage and I posted on my personal website one essay that I wrote called Goodbye Hayek about the fact that I didn't think that the GOP really made the right decision about healthcare. I think that they lost a lot of elections based on their fanatical stance against universal healthcare. And you tweeted about that recently. And for me, part of the transformation was I lost my job. I have a wife and 2 kids that I support. I'm the only breadwinner at home. And I realized that all of the platitudes coming from the GOP really didn't answer the anxieties of millions of people about healthcare. And that was one area where I noticed that Trump, he campaigned defending universal health care. And that was one of the main reasons why I liked him. That was one of the main reasons why I knew many people who voted for Obama and then went on to vote for Trump because they were concerned about health care. And then he started getting the undertow pulled him in to this free market rhetoric, the Tea Party rhetoric from 2010, where we have to shut down Obamacare. And so that was the first area. And then when I took a step back and I just looked at education, which as a professor who lost my job because of the left's warpath against any conservative professors, that was where I was really disappointed with Trump. Betsy DeVos, I mean, he wasted 4 years. There was so much that he could have done in the area of education. And that's what I talk about in this book, Church and State. For all that Trump's supporters have complained since the 1950s about education and liberal bias in education, for us to miss the opportunity that we had when there was Trump and he had both houses of Congress and just nothing changed, that was really disappointing. So I know that a lot of what you've written kind of coincides with what I've been thinking. Why do you think that more people didn't speak out earlier about a lot of these contradictions? Why is it that the free market, I guess, that three-legged stool from Reaganism, why did that revert back to the conventional wisdom again? And we saw him spouting that same kind of Cato Institute rhetoric about the lower taxes and all that stuff, and the working class populism got lost. Do you think people were afraid of standing up to it, or was it stealthy, or was it just that people had too much confidence in Trump, the personality, and they weren't really paying attention to his policies?
I think it's a mixture of different factors. I think you probably named all of the different aspects, or most of them, that all created this kind of confluence, this fog of war, where it was difficult if you were on the right, if you were a Trump supporter, to see this happening, this kind of creep, right? This creep back towards this old, broken, stale conservative consensus, because immediately in front of you, you have the left that is a very real threat. You have the Democratic Party, right? That's a real threat. You have like the Never Trumpers. So I think for people like me, I was distracted by all of these other battles. And in the back of my mind, whenever Trump did something that, didn't correspond with the mandate in 2016, it was always kind of like, well, that's unfortunate, but he's still the best we've got, and we have all of these other immediate problems that are in front of us. But at some point, for me, it just became kind of untenable. But in terms of why didn't people speak up, I think one part is this kind of like emotional cost, or not. Emotional cost is probably not correct. There's just a cost, right, of being a Trump supporter. Like, you're not just hated by Democrats and the left, you're also hated by the Never Trump right. And I think once you throw your weight in with Trump, it becomes difficult you're already kind of on an island. So then if you also start attacking Trump and calling him out for being hypocritical, or for being inconsistent, you're on an even smaller part of the island now. And if you want a case in point, Ann Coulter is a good example of this. For years, she's been saying what I started saying sometime in 2019. she lost following for it, and she lived on an island, but I mean, she's been vindicated on so many things. So I think that was part of it. This kind of like, well, if I start attacking Trump, like now I'm really kind of screwed. And I think there was probably also a more cynical aspect to it. I think that there was a lot of grifting that went on in the Trump movement. People that kind of cashed in, who initially were against Trump, but then threw their weight in behind him. I don't know, for example, if Charlie Kirk actually changed his mind about Trump. I'm just using him as an example. But if you recall, he was one of the people early on who was really opposed to Trump, thought he was a clown, and now he's the face of the Trump youth movement. And again, I don't know if he actually changed his mind, but that's an example of it. And I would say that TPUSA in general is not really a serious organization, and they're just one example of.
Oh, I mean, I went out on a limb. I really took a lot of big risks by calling them out, especially in that essay for Church and State. Someone who is an educator, I think that Trump made a huge mistake at giving Charlie Kirk that much access, that much control over the discourse, because Charlie Kirk never had a viable plan of how to change higher education. Turning Point USA does great work in terms of doing what Ben Shapiro and others didn't want to do. They actually fought on campuses to get student organizations set up. That's good, but there was no content to it. And the problem of the lack of conservative professors, that was never addressed by anybody, largely because the conservative movement never wanted to take the position of labor. They always want to identify with management. And so they never wanted to defend conservatives who were losing their jobs as professors. And the expulsion of conservative faculty on campuses was actually faster and worse under Trump than under Obama. That's just something that I hate to bring up to people, but I didn't get pushed out of the academy under Obama. That happened to me under Trump. And there was just no way for them to have our backs. So as we go forward, now that Trump is out of the way, and I don't know if you would agree with this, but I just felt such a relief, actually, once it was all over. And I feel like I can have discussions now. And even when I'm debating with liberals, I don't have to make every debate about Trump. I don't have to defend Ivanka or Kimberly Guilfoyle. So that's a big weight off of us. And that's sort of a good part of it. But where do we go from here? Who are the leaders that are left? Given that we have been so divided by the Trump years, there is such a morale problem. Who would you identify as a leader who can bring back that spirit, that momentum, and that optimism that we had when Trump first made it in?
I don't know. I don't think that there is a clear, identifiable leader. I think that there are prospects. I'm of the position of being basically anti-politician in the sense that I don't have any heroes in the GOP. I think that's a lesson. That's one lesson that people should probably take away from the Trump era, is to not, as much as possible. I think it's unavoidable to have these kind of personality cults. I think personality cults are human, right? And whether that personality cult is very bad or constructive depends on the person around whom the cult arises. So I think it's normal. But as someone who tries to be independent, I try not to do that. A lesson I learned the hard way. But as far as prospects go, in terms of political leaders, I hear Josh Hawley's name being thrown around a lot, Tom Cotton and DeSantis. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not a cheerleader for any of those people, but those are the names I keep hearing. As far as intellectual leaders, someone who I think has been consistently good is Darren Beattie. And Darren Beattie, I think, has a lot of bright ideas, and he's been on the inside. I actually have a lot of questions for him, for his positions, but I think Darren Beattie has been consistently good and really pushing the envelope on where the right should go. Recently, his new news aggregator site, Revolver, published a piece about how the military is not a conservative institution. This is a point that I've been making on Twitter. I think I might have written about it a few times, but I haven't written about it enough.
I've seen it, and I totally agree with you. I got discharged in 2012, and so I saw those tweets that you made, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, somebody's actually saying it." I'm glad. Yeah, I'm sorry. Continue.
Yeah, but I don't know if Darren actually wrote it, but Revolver News, the website, published this editorial on how the military is not a conservative institution, just like the intelligence community is not a conservative institution. And these are important points to make. and in some ways are uncomfortable for a lot of people to hear, because conservatives just naturally have a kind of inclination toward the military, to feel that it's like a safe place for them. Uh, and you saw this manifest in its most extreme and irrational form in these like crazy theories that Trump was going to reverse the course of the election by staging a kind of military coup because the military was on his side or something like that. And those fantasies are only possible because conservatives, on a basic level, still think that the military is on their side. But it's just not. As an institution, the military is just a reflection of the society it serves, and it's pretty clear that America institutionally has been undergoing a long managed decline, and the military is not exempt from that. And when you look at people like Mattis, who I think it was Mattis who said recently he looks forward to striking America first as a concept from our foreign policy with Trump gone. So that's Mattis, who was kind of deified, right, as this like ultimate warrior, the face of American badassery. And for him, America first is like sand in his mouth. And so, yeah, so I think, so that, I guess, going back to my original point, I think Beatty is someone to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's hard is it is hard for conservatives to realize how bereft they are of sympathetic institutions. The church right now is liberal, all of the Christian churches. And this is even harder to tell people than the military. You can't just throw out things and say, I represent Christians, because unfortunately, most of the Christian denominational establishment is completely on the left. The military is on the left. I think part of the problem is that a lot of people on the right don't realize how the left changed. The left that I knew, I don't know how old you are, but when I was in college in the late 80s and early 90s, the left was very anti-military, anti-police. They didn't like the idea of authoritarian enforcement. They were free speech purists, but that left is gone. You know, and I taught college from 1999 until 2019, and I watched the evolution of that millennial generation. The left that is there now loves the military. They're not against authoritarianism. They like institutions of enforcement. And so it's really hard because people who want to be intellectual thought leaders in the conservative movement still sometimes revert back to this knee-jerk pro-militarist patriotism, or the constantly throwing out Christian or religious liberty as if the churches are safe from leftism, and that's actually not true at all. So Darren Beatty sounds like an interesting person. What do you think of these groypers? Is there anything in there to revive or to hold on to, or are they just basically toxic? How would you describe their role going forward?
So I was actually one of the first people to defend, I think a better term for them is American nationalists, because they identify as amnats or groypers, but I think amnats is just easier to say for me. I was one of the first people to defend the amnats in print. I wrote an article for Crisis Magazine in, I think, late 2019. And my view then was that, look, they haven't got it all figured out, but I think they're at least pointing their guns in the right direction. And it's a better direction than TPUSA. While TPUSA is still, because I think they're the competing and the biggest youth organization, right? So obviously I'm going to use them as a prop here. TPUSA is still, after Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, American Express, Marriott International, Commerce, BankShares, PayPal, Spotlight, Shopify, Stripe, after all these institutions have put their boot around the neck of the right, or on the neck of the right, in the wake of the November election and the riot in the Capitol building, TPUSA is still saying big government sucks. They don't understand, or they don't want to understand, that the enemy is not big government, or at least that's just like that's kind of like the surface level dialogue, right? The enemy is these totally irresponsible, in the sense of they can't really be held accountable, these corporations that rival nation states in terms of power and influence. So okay, the amnats, groypers, they're at least saying this, that actually the problem is not, it's not like, who knows more about you and your personal life and is more difficult to hold accountable, Google or the CIA? It's Google. And I think the amnats understand that, at least instinctively.
I was inspired by them. I was afraid to say it publicly, but it was interesting when they had that plan where they were charting out where Ben Shapiro was going to speak and where Charlie Kirk was going to speak. Do you remember this? And they would organize people to get up there and to commandeer the question and answer session.
Yeah.
Even though I'm not comfortable with the anti-Semitic or the anti-Israel stuff, it's still, I found that means of defying conservative Inc. was a valuable model, and I wish that people had looked to it, because I also noticed that when I went to see Politicon in Los Angeles in 2018, I was sitting right next to the TPUSA booth, and all their T-shirts said "Socialism sucks," and I would stop and I would talk to them and I would try to find out, well, what about culture? What do you think about defending American culture or defending America's spiritual health or the national identity? And they just didn't have an answer to that. And I think that if you don't defend the culture of a country, then you are defenseless against the id, the roving desires of the consumer, right? If all we're going to do is just rely on free market forces. I mean, I don't know if free market forces are all healthy, but it's interesting. I don't know. You seem to have noticed the same thing, because I've noticed it in your tweets. It seems like all of the free market rhetoric is really hard to get. It's easy to get the populists out there to move away from that, but it's hard sometimes to get the established people, the thought leaders, to stop putting everything in terms of free market ideology, because the free market ideology will not necessarily solve a country's cultural confusion or its identity crisis.
Yeah, no, that's right. And really quick, I'll go back to the Mnets. My basic point is that they're rough around the edges, but I think the important takeaway is that you have young people who are super angry at the system, and they are open to ideas that totally violate the conservative consensus. In other words, they're willing to fight. So I think if they can just get I think hopefully with time and moderation, they'll become part of something bigger than themselves. So I think that's my key takeaway there. And it's frustrating that they latch themselves onto Trump so closely, because I think that was just a really bad influence on them. But most of them are really young, so hopefully they grow out of that. And the thing with the other one more thing is that you'll notice that after those kids trolled Charlie Kirk at all of his different, ironically named culture war tour stops, Charlie changed his rhetoric. So they hounded him on basically being pro-corporate at a few of these stops. And if you notice that, like, basically after this long trolling that he got, he started to say things that basically sounded just like them. And I pointed this out, like, are you going to apologize to these kids who you called white nationalists and called socialists, because now you're saying the same things that they were saying to you a few months ago.
Right.
So I think that's interesting that he didn't acknowledge that that basically they made him change his mind, at least his rhetoric. So I think that was an interesting development to see Charlie Kirk say the same thing that his hecklers were saying just 2 months ago.
Right.
But, in terms of why do big influencers not change their tune, I think a lot of it has to do with money, obviously, and perhaps a fear of losing your following. Mm-hmm. You built a following on being like a turbo capitalist, kind of like one of these meme people like Benny Johnson or something, or even Don Jr. And let's say you do a 180 and suddenly you start saying, like, we need to, like, nationalize Twitter, or that we need to take the antitrust hammer and smash Google to pieces.
Yeah.
I think you're hesitant to say that because you're like, well, I'm going to lose I built my whole following on being like a capitalist. And now I'm saying things that people are going to say sound socialist. So, and obviously with a following comes an income. So I think that's one huge part of it. Ultimately just money and clout, a word that I hate to use, but it's a word. So
how much do you think that we need to rely on the old model of finding photogenic spokespeople? This is one thing that drives me crazy. I think that Lauren Boebert seems like she's really interesting, but I just don't think we need another smoking hot babe talking about her gun. We do it with both men and women. Honestly, we find pretty faces and we put them out there. It's really a conservative disease to hang all of your hopes. I'm looking at Madison Cawthorn, and I was so impressed when you tweeted something where you were calling out Madison Cawthorn, because I was like, are people going to call him out? He just seems like he's Dan Crenshaw 2.0, right? We go after these attractive, athletic looking, wholesome people, and you find out within minutes that it's so skin deep. They're just a pretty face that has been coached. I mean, where did that come from? Is it just because of the Fox News aesthetic with all of the blonde women with the low cut dresses, and we got addicted to that? But I really feel like we have lost so much of our capital just based on trying to market to people's shallow instincts.
Well, I actually, I walk two roads here. I actually think aesthetics are important. So I think it actually does help to find people who are handsome, but they have to have good ideas. And I think that conservatism, and I'm not actually sure that this is just conservatism. I think it's just the times, right? We only care about the one thing, the pretty face. We don't care about the ideas.
Right.
And I think maybe conservatives are especially bad at this. And I think that it seems that they are especially bad at this because they're supposed to be the conservatives, right? They're supposed to be the ones that are modest. They're supposed to be the ones that are not superficial and not plastic. And I think that hypocrisy makes it seem so much worse when you have obviously a spokesperson who is only a spokesperson because they're a pretty face. It's the kind of the idea of like sex sells, right? It's like that's supposed to be a left-wing thing. That's supposed to be a libertine thing, not a conservative thing.
Right.
But it is. But I actually do think that it helps at least to have an aesthetic movement. And I think this was part of the allure of someone like Bronze Age pervert. This idea of vitalism, of physical fitness, of beauty, because ultimately what we're talking about is aesthetic standards. There is such a thing as beautiful. There is such a thing as beautiful architecture, just like there's such a thing as a beautiful person. So I think aesthetics do matter, but to your point, we only care about pretty faces.
Yeah, I just feel like we've gotten too much into it.
Yes.
Because so that was one thing. Like when I saw the footage of Kelly Loeffler with her rifle at the range with the long blonde hair, I just it's like, please, can we find a new model?
Paul calls them Fox News blondes.
Yeah,
that's what he calls them.
I kind of want maybe I don't agree with you on that with the aesthetics, because I kind of want to see just overweight, out of shape, like 60-year-olds.
Yeah.
I want to see some kind of people like that there. But how can I think you are probably one of my top 10 people that I would like to see get a big platform. How can people support you? Are you willing to step into that role of being a good spokesperson, like a spokesperson, or is that something that you'd feel like you just want to write and not be in the spotlight? How would people support someone like you? How would we get you a bigger, footprint?
I don't know. I kind of got thrust into this because for whatever reason, Tucker Carlson was kind enough to bring me on his show 4 or 5 times last year in the span of like 2 or 3 months. And that was really when my following on social media started to grow, because before then I avoided cameras and interviews like the plague, not because I was in high demand, because I wasn't, but just because I'm a writer. I'm not a talker, and the idea of sitting in front of a camera and talking to someone was always just kind of intimidating to me. And there was also the fear of I don't know, be clowning myself, right? But since I went on Tucker, I started to get invited onto other platforms like One America News Network and Newsmax and The Hill TV with Sagar and Genty and his show Rising. So it seems like my platform is growing organically, which I'm happy about, because
that's good. Yeah.
Right. Because it's growing organically, the people that are following me on wherever I am, they actually seem to really like my ideas. And they interact with me a lot on whatever platform I'm on. So that's great. I don't have an institutional backing, I don't have the Heritage Foundation behind me or something, so I can't pay basically for followers, and promote myself aggressively. So it is growing slowly but surely, and I never wanted to be a guy who's in front of cameras, but um, I think it's actually turning out to be constructive.
Mhm.
The other, sorry, go ahead.
Sometimes it's not really about what you want, it's about what God,
Right.
where
Yeah.
God puts you, but I think like you're the type of person I think who would be really great in that role. And thank goodness you're not tied to the Heritage Foundation. Oh my gosh. That was my other question is what are we going to do with all these think tanks that I've just had it up to here with? And the lawyers, all of the conservative lawyers that all had the same mentors and they had the same approach when they were fighting abortion, when they were fighting gay marriage, and then when they fought the election fraud, it was the same approach. They always felt that the best way to win cases, and it never worked, they felt that the best way to win cases was to not directly antagonize the point that they were trying to make, right? So they didn't want to say homosexuality is inferior to heterosexuality, but they found some procedural technicalities like, oh, well, what if somebody doesn't want to bake a cake for a gay wedding? We'll make all of the emphasis about that. And of course, they lose the whole point. And they did that on abortion. They did that on the election. I feel like we have this army of lawyers who all had the same mentors. They went to the same law schools. They were brought up through the same conferences. They clerked with the same people, and they just have a losing legal strategy that they have followed again and again and again. That's a perfect example. What do we do with those think tanks? I'm pretty sure that you've noticed the same thing, that a lot of our think tanks, a lot of our para institutions, these institutes, these foundations that have cropped up over the years are just no longer, they're not reliable. They don't win, and they tend not to back us up. They drag people into battles. Sometimes you're the poster boy for like 2 months, and then they just leave you out to dry. Should we try to reform those, or are you just all out for let's go build an alternative universe? What do you think?
Yes, I'm for the latter. I think that we need to build our own think tanks. We need to build our own institutions. I think the advice I give people is do not give a cent to Heritage or Cato or the American Enterprise Institute. Do not subscribe to newspapers like the Daily Wire, not the Daily Wire, National Review.
Right.
I think National Review is probably the most egregious example of a waste of money in print.
Mm-hmm.
That has been a drum that I've been beating for a while. Stop giving money to old, like legacy conservative institutions. Don't give them clicks. Don't visit their pages.
Mm-hmm.
Don't promote them. Don't go to their events. Starve them of money, which is going to be difficult because, of course, it's not your money that they really care about. It's the big money, like Koch Industries money,
right?
Paul Singer's money. That's like, if you don't know Paul Singer, and AEI I'm sure he has a good relationship with Heritage, but he also has a good relationship with the American Enterprise Institute.
I have been tracking Paul Singer for years and years and years. He gave $2.5 million to the Human Rights Campaign for this project called the Global Equality Fund, which all they did was they tracked down 24 people that they defined as a global threat to LGBT rights, and I was number 2 on that list. For the very simple reason that I exposed abuse that was happening in the LGBT community. I mean, it was, Paul Singer is egregious. It's terrible. I'd love to build alternative institutes, and that's why I love working with gatekeepers. It's a small outfit right now, but I love working with things that I think like if they can just find that magic pot at the end of some rainbow, I know that they'll explode because the content is there. There are so many good content creators in the conservative world. The problem is there's so few platforms, that because we have this celebrity culture, and those conservative celebrities really dominate the discussion. Last question I have, and then I'll let you go, is what does working class conservatism look like? And is that something that you want to be at the forefront, or do you want to back away from the class discussion? You know, I have a good friend who's a far left socialist, and we agree on a lot of stuff that I'm embarrassed to say that we agree on. We really do. And, you know, we were talking the day after the January 6th Capitol riot, and she said that was a class revolt. And she's kind of like arguing with all of her left-wing people. And I feel like that's true. It was kind of it was a class revolt. You know, and there's times that Black Lives Matter and Antifa do things where I'm like, well, you know, whatever. Maybe we should do stuff like that. I don't know. But I'm kind of going on a tangent there. But what would working class conservatism look like? Does it exist? Is that really a viable position to take, or is that basically surrendering to the left's class-based discourse? What do you think?
No, I think there are real grievances to be addressed, right? And the first question is, what is the working class? And I think that we associate the working class with people who work with their hands, industrial workers, people like that, blue collar workers. But in the modern age, it's not just blue collar workers who have experienced proletarianization. It's also white collar workers, like tech workers especially. These people have been victimized by outsourcing through visa worker programs. It's also pink collar workers. These are service industry workers who work in these really demanding, high stress jobs and do it for pennies. And they live in shoeboxes or they live in their cars, right? So in other words, they end up getting trapped in these jobs because that might be all that they can get in the given place that they live, right? And they'd have to leave wherever they are to find a better job. And so that's the first thing, is working class is actually an expansive term. It's not just blue collar plumber people. It's blue collar, white collar, pink collar. It's basically everyone who has been victimized by globalization. So that's the first thing, is changing the way that we think about the working class. The second thing is, yes, I think that is the future. It's not that I think it's the future. It is the future. There's no going back to the kind of aristocratic conservatism of being a conservative in this old-fashioned sense of being like pro-capitalist and stuff like that. It's like being a member of the proletariat and defending the oligarchy. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Right.
And in terms of models, because you'll hear people say, well, like we've never had anything like this. Like populism is so foreign to the United States. Look at Huey Long. And it's interesting that Huey Long is seeing a revival and that Longism is becoming of interest again. So there is a model for this. I think there is a way forward. And I think it's a mixture of looking into the past and seeing what others have done and figuring out a way to make that work as we go forward.
Right. It's really funny. I'll leave you with this thought. Recently, I got these young people that I'm mentoring and tutoring. I sat down, we were studying the Crusades and the Middle Ages. And, we read some Shakespeare plays about King John and Richard the Lionhearted. And I just popped in the 1937 version of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn. And I realized, oh my gosh, in the English speaking world, there is this tradition of because that story of Robin Hood, he was not trying to tear down the monarchy. He wasn't trying to tear down the nation. They were extremely conservative in what they were saying rhetorically, which was that Richard was the legitimate king and John was a false king. And the fact that John's taxes were being expropriated in all of these unfair ways. It was a working class movement, but it was very much a conservative type of uprising against what they saw as the abuses. And that, feeds into how the Magna Carta came into the lexicon, how that entered into our historical record. So I agree with you there. And I'm going to continue to follow what you're doing. I'll keep on retweeting your stuff. I mean, it was so funny when I actually was able to get a hold of you, because I think I retweet like probably one out of every three things. I think you're onto a lot of really good stuff. And there's just there's not enough people who are willing to break with conservative ink, So I really hope that we can support you in any way that we can. All the people with little followings here and there, if you add them all together, I think it can become a big movement. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Pedro. How can people follow you, and are there books you want to tell people to buy or anything like that? You have free reign. Tell us how to log into your world.
Well, I haven't written any books yet, but I'll let you know if I do. But if you want to follow me, you can go to my newsletter at contra.substack.com. If you go to the About page on my newsletter, you'll see all of my different social media contact info. So I'm on Gab, I'm on Twitter. I was on Parler before Parler got nuked. So I'm on Eventually I'll probably be on Twitch too, and I'm going to putz around with some streaming.
Yeah.
But yeah, all of my contact info is in my newsletter. So that's contra.substack.com.
Okay, great. And to anyone out there who's listening, a couple other announcements I just wanted to bring up. From now on, Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time is my permanent schedule. I'm so happy that the people at Gatekeepers gave me a permanent time slot. That's great. I want to express my gratitude to Jeff Dornick on that. There's a new book out that Gatekeepers Online has just published called Church and State, How the Left Used the Church to Conquer America. I have a chapter in there about the problem with the seminaries. There's also a discussion group online for this show, gatekeepersonline.com/group/the-big-brown-gadfly/discussion. And that's all for tonight. So thank you so much for joining us, Pedro. Thanks everyone for joining in. And we hope that we can have you on again sometime. All right.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.